I acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose lands we're meeting today, as well as the Gadigal, Bidjigal and Birrabirragal people on whose land the electorate of Wentworth lies. First Nations people have taken care of this country for 65,000 years. They need to be acknowledged in our Constitution and listened to in our country. This should have happened decades and decades ago. We cannot let another year go by without changing it. Earlier this year, over 200 people gathered in my electorate to launch Wentworth for the Voice. We met at Bronte Beach, along the coast that Cook's Endeavour sailed 250 years ago, and were generously welcomed to country by Nolene Timbery, the chair of the La Perouse Aboriginal Land Council. La Perouse, just a little south of Wentworth, is one of Australia's most important Aboriginal communities. The families of La Perouse are the descendants of those who once lived around Sydney and Botany Bay. This referendum is not about race, as some have claimed. It is about history. It is about coming to terms with our nation's history and moving forward together. The families of La Perouse were living around Kurnell, or Gundul as they called it, on the 29th of April 1770, when the Endeavour anchored in Botany Bay. Those on board the Endeavour could see families on the beach, so James Cook, Joseph Banks and a small party rowed to shore. The families retreated, but two warriors stood their ground. The people of La Perouse, the descendants of those warriors, have passed the story from generation to generation. The families on that beach thought perhaps Cook and his crew were ghosts. The warriors shouted across the water, telling the ghosts to go away. Cook and Banks were also confused. Neither they nor their Polynesian translator could understand the warnings from the shore. When the warriors refused to back down, Cook loaded his musket and fired a warning shot. That didn't work, so he reloaded his musket with small shot and fired again, wounding one man in his leg. After the warriors were driven away, Cook and his party came ashore. They inspected the camp, and when they returned to the Endeavour later that day, they stole the spears the community used for fishing and hunting, taking with them to England as museum curiosities. This first encounter had so many of the characteristics that would typify the future: invasion, confusion, violence and theft. We cannot move forward without acknowledging the truth of this country's shameful history of failing our First Nations people and the trauma that persists through generations. The failures aren't confined to the distant past, and the failures of the past are compounded by the policy failures of today. This isn't about guilt. This isn't about the current generation of Australians being responsible for this history. But we need to recognise history is not locked away in the past and forgotten. History has consequences, and it is our responsibility to deal with them. This year, some spears of that story, those that were taken by Cook, are being returned to the La Perouse community, over 250 years since they were taken. They will start a new history back in their homeland. We in this Parliament and in this country too have the chance to write a new chapter of our history this year. The stories of our past do not need to be those of our future. In the words of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, with substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Australia is a wonderful country. Australian people have strong values: fair go, compassion, decency, optimism. We have a bright future ahead of us. Noel Pearson described us having three epic stories in our country: the story of the longest continuous civilization in the world, the story of our British institutions and democracy, and the story of the most successful multicultural society on earth. In his words, a Declaration of Australia should have 3 verses, but it must be one song. This is the opportunity we have today. And this is what this bill is about. This bill sets up the referendum that will go to the people of Australia later this year to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our Constitution and to establish a voice that can make representations to Parliament and the Executive about policies that affect them. It is about recognition and listening. Let me consider each of these in turn. This bill is about recognition. Recognition is important because the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent. It is appropriate that the foundation document of this country, our Constitution, acknowledges that. It's quite simple. Frankly, that recognition should have been included in the original draft of our Constitution, but there were no Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people participants in the Constitutional Convention over a century ago. It is time to set that history straight. This bill is about listening. From Australia's first days, we have made laws and policies for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but crucially not with them. The annual Closing the Gap statements demonstrate time and time again this approach doesn't work. The numbers tell the story. The incarceration rates that make our First Nations people the most incarcerated people on earth. That shames me as a proud Australian. The 7 to 9 differences in life expectancy between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their non-Indigenous brethren. Only 4 of the 17 Closing the Gap goals are on track as of last year. We cannot accept this. We need a new approach because it just isn't working. I come back to the Uluru Statement from the heart to understand why. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in 2 worlds and their culture will be a gift to this country. Empower our people. That is the phrase I focus on. Empowering the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people so that they can flourish. That is what the voice can enable, by listening to the voices of the people who will be affected by the policies and laws. It is critical that this listening is embedded in the Constitution so that it cannot be created or destroyed by the stroke of a politician's pen. Institution after institution have been created and dismantled as the political winds blew first this way and then that. This is no way to change the course of our history. It is critical that this listening starts at the local and regional levels and then feeds up to the national level. I welcome the government's commitment to this. It is also critical that this listening extends to the executive as well as the parliament. So many of the policies that affect people do not pass through these walls. The legislation is often just a framework under which policies are developed and implemented. It is also critical that the primacy of Parliament is not disturbed, that the democratic institutions that underpin our country remain strongly intact. And that is why I support the third and final statement that the Parliament shall have the power to make laws with respect to the voice. This is a simple proposal. It is modest. The Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community have asked for the voice in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and they overwhelmingly support it today, as do many people in Wentworth. Wentworth people know that this is a question for the Australian people, not politicians. So many in my community are already doing what they do best when they want change. They are organising.
Debate